Architecture has shaped our history, our future, our culture, our entire world. It is the world's most essential art form, hiding in plain sight. Our ancestors left us breathtaking relics of their world that we are able to enjoy and cherish to this very day. Yet so many of us take it for granted. Their accomplishments are amongst the greatest in all of human history. But is there a hidden story to these generational monuments? And I'm here in Milan to answer your questions about how our ancestors managed to build such phenomenal architecture all around the world. Some people would have you believe that this is the result of a global conspiracy to hide an empire from our history books. But I'm here to tell you that the answer is far, far simpler. Welcome to The Worldview. I am Aaron wait, hold on. Wait, one sec. Perfect. Hello everyone, welcome to The Worldview. My name is Aaron Chandler Blake and this is Debunking Tartaria Part 3. If you've been here before, then you've probably got a good idea on what to expect from this series. If you're new here, first of all, I'm very glad to have you. And secondly, you're in for a pretty wild ride with this Tartaria stuff. If you haven't watched Part 1 or Part 2 from this series and don't feel like you have to understand today's video, the series has been designed in a way that allows you to watch the episodes in whichever order you want. But if you do want to watch Part 1 and Part 2, then I will leave the links to those videos in the description. So far in this series, we have looked at the origins of the Tartarian theory, we've looked at the history of the Tartarian people, we've looked at some old world maps, we've debunked the Mudflood theory, and I've replied to some mean comments as well. Next on the agenda is architecture. So, here it goes. Have you ever wondered how our ancestors managed to build such magnificent architecture with such seemingly primitive tools? Well, according to Tartarian theorists, a lot of these grand old buildings that we see today were actually built by the Tartarians using ancient advanced technology that is far superior to anything we have available today. These buildings typically have spires, ornate facades, domes, symmetry, intricate masonry, and immense scale. These buildings apparently had the ability to harness free energy from the atmosphere too. They did this using specially built bricks that could store the energy and wirelessly transfer it to wherever it was needed. Theorists also claim we did not build these structures, instead we merely found them after the collapse of the Tartarian Empire and the Great Reset. The evidence cited by theorists to support this includes the immense scale of old world buildings that they claim would have been impossible to construct using the tools that were available at the time. They also point to the World's Fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries as proof that we used to have access to technology that far exceeds anything we have available today. Theorists also suggest that these now demolished World Fair structures were actually Tartarian buildings. Plus, the sharp increase in colonial architecture in the mid-late 1800s is also used as proof that we found these buildings rather than built them ourselves. Finally, theorists claim that we do not build wonders anymore, and they say that we don't build wonders anymore because we can't. They claim that we can't build wonders anymore because apparently the Tartarian technology that was used to make these old world buildings has been hidden from us by the world elite. In today's episode, I'm going to debunk each of these claims by looking at history, by doing a few case studies on Tartarian buildings, looking at different architectural styles, looking at modern construction achievements, and looking at why architecture has evolved over the centuries. But I won't go into the Great Reset today because I already covered that in episode 2, and I probably won't do much on the free energy stuff today either because that's going to be the main focus of episode 5. Plus, this is already shaping up to be the longest episode of the entire series, so if I start roping in the Great Reset and free energy, we'll end up being here all day. A lot of misconceptions about architecture stem from people's misunderstanding of colonialism, so I want to cover this first. As I already mentioned, Tartarian buildings typically have spires, ornate facades, domes, symmetry, intricate masonry, and immense scale. Theorists claim that these features are signatures of Tartarian architecture. In reality though, they've just made the description of a Tartarian building as vague as possible, so they can slap a Tartarian label on any Baroque, Gothic, neoclassical or Renaissance building they set their eyes on. The fact of the matter is most of these Tartarian buildings around the world are just relics of our colonial past, as we will come to see. But Aaron, colonialism was going on for centuries. Why are most of the colonial buildings we see now only dated to the 1800s? Excellent question. An excellent question with an answer that has been weaponized by Tartarian theorists to suit their own agenda and narrative. Theorists seem to view the volume of 19th century colonial buildings as evidence that we found them instead of building them ourselves, as they date to roughly the same time as the alleged mudflood or mudfloods. But there is a far more realistic answer to this question, and it involves two very important events. The first of these events was the reinvention of ships. For most of human history, we used boats made of wood to travel across the seas. This proved very effective for a long time, but wooden ships do have their flaws, and human progress needed something a bit more substantial. Wooden vessels were limited in their size, they were limited in the amount of cargo they could carry, they were also limited in their speed, they needed constant repairs which made them expensive to maintain, and the average lifespan for an ocean-faring ship was usually pretty short. Even famous ships like Captain Cook's HMS Endeavour was only active for 11 years, and Francis Drake's Golden Hind was only in active service for 3 years. Looking for faster and more capable ships, Britain started experimenting with metal vessels in the late 18th century. Off the back of this, the first metal-hulled ship, a river barge simply called the Trial, was launched in 1787. Then in 1819, SS Savannah became the first steam-powered vessel to complete a transatlantic voyage. Paddle wheels were then replaced by propellers in the 1840s, which made ships faster, and in 1843 a man named Isambard Kingdom Brunel, absolutely fantastic name by the way, developed the first ship built entirely from wrought iron. All of this progress allowed colonial powers to build ships that were bigger, stronger and faster than their wooden counterparts. Because of this, colonial powers can now transport more building materials at once, and they could transport them quicker, which meant they were able to embark on a lot more elaborate architectural projects in the far-reaching corners of their empires. This is why British colonial buildings suddenly shot up in Malaya, French buildings shot up in Indochina, and Dutch buildings shot up in the Dutch East Indies. These buildings didn't suddenly appear because we found them all at once after a great reset. They appeared all around the same time because of advancements in shipping technology, which meant we could transport more materials and workers much more easily. The second event that caused a sharp increase in colonial architecture, especially in Southeast Asia and Oceania, was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. The opening of the canal cut voyage distances from Europe to Asia by up to 7,000 kilometers, meaning that voyages could be completed in significantly less time. As ships are now completing their journeys in a lot less time, it meant they could do a lot more voyages. All of this meant that ships are now not only quicker and could carry more, but they had to cover a far shorter distance as well. The opening of Singapore's first brick kiln by Narayana Pillai in 1819 also sped up construction projects in Southeast Asia significantly. These buildings popped up around the world because they followed the pattern of colonial powers who wanted to consolidate their authority in the far-reaching corners of their empire. They were able to do this because of big advancements in technology, in shipping, and also the opening of the Suez Canal, which meant they could transport more materials, do it quicker, and do it cheaper. So just to conclude on all of that, we did not find these buildings, we built them ourselves, and we were more than capable of doing so. And isn't it strange that Tartarian architecture only seems to pop up in places that were colonized by Western powers? Like, for example, it's really weird how there's no Tartarian architecture in places that were never colonized by Western powers, places like Bhutan and Nepal and Tajikistan. Yet there's plenty of allegedly Tartarian architecture in places that were colonized by the West, places like Hong Kong, places like Vietnam, places like the Philippines. It's even weirder how different styles of Tartarian buildings tend to correlate with the architectural style of the European countries that colonized those areas according to our conventional history. Case in point, Spanish colonial architecture includes a lot of features such as ceiling paintings, or frescoes to use their proper name. It also has ceiling domes, it has rows of pillars, arches and ornate roofing. Many examples of these types of buildings can be found in places that were former Spanish colonies, places like Mexico, Peru and the Philippines. To find out more, I went to the Philippines to see some of this allegedly Tartarian architecture for myself.
Do you think these are loaded?
Manila, the Filipino capital, is a treasure trove of colonial architecture filled with Mediterranean-style streets, stone fortresses and ornate churches. Walking around the city, you'll find it hard to see any British architectural styles, and that's because they weren't a major colonial power here. Do you see how that works? There's a very obvious reason why we find allegedly Tartarian architecture in places like Lima and Manila, but not in cities like Kathmandu and Dushanbe. This is not a difficult pattern to follow, believe me. Like, we find different styles of colonial architecture around the world, and the pattern of these correlates with the style of architecture from the colonial powers who colonized that place. It is colonial architecture, not Tartarian. On a side note, I do find it kind of funny that a lot of these leading Tartarian theorists never actually seem to do any travelling themselves and pass judgment on places they've never been to. Maybe if they saw more of the world and took more time to understand people's culture and history, then they wouldn't believe in any of this rubbish. But here we are. Okay, it's time for our first case study. One piece of colonial architecture that gets roped into the Tartarian discussion on occasion is the Saigon Governor's Palace in Vietnam, which you may recognise as the building in the centre of my chapter slates for every video. The claim that this could not have been built using 19th century technology is obviously insinuated by the Post, and the same sentiment is echoed in the comments section. However, like literally every other aspect of the Tartarian theory, the truth prevails after a little bit of research. Firstly, their evidence of buildings being found is pretty limited, but one of the main points they raise is that a lot of these buildings have the years they were founded etched onto them. They say that this is proof we found the buildings because they say founded on them. That's literally it. That's their proof. I'm not joking. I really wish I was, but I'm not. When you see found or founded written on a building, that is the date the foundation stone of the building was laid. It doesn't literally mean someone found the building when they were out for a walk one day. Now that we've cleared that up, Tartarian theorists seem to ignore the fact that the 19th century wasn't even that long ago. By the end of the 19th century, we had telephones, we had railway systems, we had transatlantic steel ships, and we even had electric cars. Yes, that is true, look it up. People in the 19th century had far more technology than Tartarian theorists would give them credit for. Just because the pictures are black and white, it doesn't mean they were living in the Stone Age. Next, let's look at some history Clark Payne conveniently leaves out of his original post, because as we all know, the kryptonite of the Tartarian theory is of course context. Saigon Governor's Palace was built in Saigon. Well, obviously. However, the city is now known as Ho Chi Minh City. The palace was built by the French to assert their colonial dominance in the area, as at the time Vietnam was part of French Indochina. Despite what Clark Payne and his followers would have you believe, we know who built this, we know when it was built, and we know how it was built. The foundation stone was laid by Governor Paul-Pierre de la Grandière on the 23rd of March 1868, and construction finished in 1873. The neo-Baroque, not Tartarian, style of the building was the product of architect Antoine Achille Hermite. Hermite was also famous for designing several other buildings in Southeast Asia from 1865 to 1870, such as Hong Kong City Hall, the Palace of King Norodom in Cambodia, and the tomb of St. Francis Xavier in British India. But back to the original point. Hermite sourced many of the building materials for Saigon Governor's Palace from France. We know this because other French colonial buildings that were built in the same area around the same time, such as the Notre Dame Basilica of Saigon, also used materials from France. These included bricks from Toulouse and tiles from Marseille, most of which were shipped to Vietnam via the newly opened Suez Canal. Some building materials for the Saigon projects were also sourced a lot more locally from a Cantonese brickmaker named Wong Tai, who made a fortune out of opium smuggling during the Opium Wars. Wong Tai's bricks were used in the construction alongside French imports for both the Saigon Governor's Palace and the Notre Dame Basilica of Saigon. Meanwhile, skilled workers were imported from Canton, which is now known as Guangzhou, to complete the construction. All of this proves we know who built it, when it was built, how it was built, and even where the materials came from. No mystery involved, it's not Tartarian, end of discussion. The last point I want to make about colonialism is the development of Australia. Now this gets pulled into the Tartarian theory quite a lot, which is why I want to cover it now. People claim that the architecture we see in Australia could not have been built by colonial powers in the time frame offered by conventional history. People also question why such elaborate architecture was built for what was effectively an island full of convicts. Both of these ideas are actually very misleading though, and they're based on big misconceptions that a lot of people have about the history of Australia, and we're going to look at those now. The British officially colonised Australia in 1788, but they were not the first people to discover it. In fact, several people had visited it for over 150 years before the British began their colonisation. And the first recorded landing on Australia by a European was Willem Janszoon in 1606. Britain wasn't even the first country to consider colonising Australia either, as Neuchâtel, the Swedish Empire, the Dutch Empire, and even Latvia all had plans to colonise New Holland as it was then known. In 1766, John Calendar proposed the idea of Britain setting up shop in New Holland and sending convicts there. And after Britain lost the Revolutionary War a decade later, it was decided that new territory was needed to replace what had been lost in North America. The first British colonial ship arrived in Australia on the 18th of January 1788 with 700 convicts on board on what is now Sydney Harbour. Where our first big misconception of Australian history comes into play, as not everyone who went to Australia was actually a convict. In fact, only about 20% of the people who went to Australia were convicts. The rest of the people were free settlers who went there under their own free will, and the first of these arrived in 1793. The other big misconception is that all of the convicts were sent were just vagabonds or beggars who weren't really contributing anything useful to society. Lots of people also seem to believe that these criminals that are being deported had committed really heinous crimes. But the fact of the matter is the most common deportation-worthy crimes were fraud and theft, and a lot of the people that were sent to Australia were actually skilled labourers. Convicts and free settlers continued to enter Australia at a pretty steady pace until about the 1820s. At which point free settlers started to move to the country at a much more rapid rate. Coincidentally, this is around the same time we start seeing grand architecture appear across Australia thanks to the larger labour force and the higher need for infrastructure. I mean, the British Empire always had really high hopes for Australia. It was abundant in natural resources, it had lots of open land, it was almost completely uncontested from other European superpowers who were completely occupied in other places around the world. This is why Britain was so keen to send free settlers and also so keen to exploit free convict labour so they could prepare infrastructure for this new colony. Britain started to build grander architecture as more people started to arrive in Australia. And another big misconception is the idea that the British were building breathtaking architecture in Australia from the moment they arrived. That is not true. Elizabeth Farm in Sydney is the oldest surviving colonial building in Australia, and it was built in 1793 as a free settler farmstead. I would like to see anyone argue that we can't recreate this in modern technology. Then around 25 years later we have Hyde Park Barracks that was built in 1819. It was designed by architect Francis Greenway under the order of Lachlan Macquarie. It took 2 years to build and the bricks are locally sourced from a nearby clay field called Brickfield Hill. The building was then constructed using very widespread 19th century architectural practices such as lime mortar and a bricklaying technique called the Flemish bond. So it was good of the Tartarians to build these structures back in the old world using a building technique that matched the style of European settlers who found them several generations later. What a fantastic coincidence! Finally, there's Rookwood Cemetery Train, which I've seen accredited to Tartaria more times than I could ever possibly care to remember. First of all, it was built in 1864. That's over 70 years after British colonialism started in Australia. This fact alone completely discredits the idea that we just found it. Rookwood Cemetery is only 15 kilometres away from the original Sydney Harbour settlement as the crow flies. So unless it took us 76 years to make it 15 kilometres inland, I'm pretty sure this wasn't a found building. Theorists also like to claim that the size of this train station was complete overkill for its purpose and the size of the population in Australia at the time. Both of these notions are a complete load of rubbish. Australia's population was already well over 1 million by 1864, and still to this day, Rookwood Cemetery is the biggest necropolis in the entire southern hemisphere. Rookwood Necropolis, or Rookwood Cemetery, whichever name you prefer, is so huge because for a large portion of its history it was the only major cemetery in all of eastern Australia. When the Town Hall and Devonshire cemeteries both closed in the mid-19th century, Rookwood picked up the slack and almost all of the local funeral traffic was sent there. So this train was not overkill. If anything, it wasn't enough to keep up with the demand. The train wasn't just for dead bodies either, it was for mourners too. The train ran regular services to and from Sydney city centre so people could attend funerals and pay their respects at graves. Despite what theorists say, conventional history does not say or does not claim that this beautiful train station was built purely for trains full of corpses, because it wasn't. These examples show us how architecture in Australia slowly got more complex and more elaborate as British settlers spent more time there. The history of architecture in Australia does in fact add up. The resources were found locally, the workforce was there, the demand for the infrastructure was there. It is not an island full of convicts and none of it is Tartaria. Arguably the most common Tartarian theory claim you will see relating to architecture is that we could not have built these wondrous old world buildings with the technology we had available at the time. And their alternative suggestion is that we found these buildings after the Great Reset. Like I mentioned earlier, I won't go into the Great Reset now as I already covered it in the last episode. But as I just touched on, the main claim of these buildings is that our ancestors could not have built them using the technology and equipment they had available at the time. For example, you've probably seen a lot of Tartarian posts citing hammers and chisels or horses and donkeys as the equipment our ancestors used to construct these buildings. But saying we built things like Westminster Abbey with hammers and chisels is like saying we built stealth bombers with spanners and screwdrivers. They had cranes, pulley systems, levers, non-electric mechanisms and more which allowed them to lift heavy objects into place. The idea that we couldn't have lifted these heavy construction blocks into place with the equipment we had available at the time is complete and utter nonsense. It has been debunked so many times by so many different people. I'm actually baffled that people still give this part of the conspiracy airtime and think it's going to prove anything. Plus, with the amount of money, manpower and especially time they had available back then, it is completely believable that they could have made these structures. In fact, the insane construction timelines for some of these buildings proves objectively that they were not made by an advanced civilization. St. Peter's Basilica took 120 years to build, Buckingham Palace took 150 years, and Cologne Cathedral took 600 years to build. So if these places were built by the Tartarians and they were as hyper advanced as you'd have us believe, then what the hell took them so long? And I can already see the replies to that in the comments. Yeah, but these construction records are faked by the world elite. Well, if you think these incredibly well documented construction records that included thousands of builders across several generations are fake, then please feel free to prove it. As for transporting materials, it was difficult, but it was far more possible than theorists would have you believe. Theorists suggest that even getting the materials to these construction sites, let alone actually using them to build these monuments, would have been impossible, and they cite a lack of infrastructure, particularly roads, as proof of this. Let's take the United States in the 1800s as a case study to prove why this is not true. Heavy building materials were usually transported along dirt roads using specially built wagons that were pulled by teams of horses or oxen. These wagons were called Conestoga wagons, which are not to be confused with the much smaller prairie wagons, and they could carry up to 5 short tons at a time. Their curved beds stopped loads from shifting, and the large wheels and horse-drawn power meant they could easily navigate through roads even if they became muddy after heavy rainfall. However, heavier loads were transported using railways or river barges where possible, such as the Granite Railway, which opened in 1826 and was used to build a number of large monuments in the United States, such as Boston Customs House. So there were no airships needed, there was no ancient technology that's been hidden from us that was needed, there was no Tartarian Empire needed. Our ancestors managed to build these amazing monuments just fine without all of them. Additionally, a lot of the ideas that these buildings are found stem from the idea that we have no construction photos of them. However, a lot of these rumours seem to be circulated by people who have never even tried to find construction photos of these buildings, because if they had, they would have found loads. Case in point is the Eiffel Tower. People claim that this is built using Tartarian technology or that it's way older than people say. However, these construction photos of the Eiffel Tower were taken by Edouard de Randel at the request of Gustave Eiffel himself. All you need to do is look up Eiffel Tower construction photos and well, look at that, there's loads. Plus, there's a very obvious reason why we don't have construction photos of buildings that were made before the 19th century. If you're one of the people watching this who thinks our construction records for the Eiffel Tower are fake, then please go ahead and find me a photo of it from 1885 to prove your point. Also, the Tokyo Tower is pretty much a 1-to-1 scale of the Eiffel Tower, and it was completed in 1958 after 18 months of construction. So before you suggest otherwise, yes, we can and have recreated this construction of the past in the modern day. Then finally, there's the argument that we don't have construction records or blueprints for these allegedly Tartarian buildings, which yet again is a massive lie. Let's take the Capitol building in Washington DC as an example, because it gets roped into this theory quite consistently. This is allegedly a Tartarian building, yet there are architectural construction drawings for it readily available online from multiple sources. They also include plans drawn by William Thornton, Thomas U. Walter, and other architects who worked on the Capitol building. So again, we know who built it, we know when they built it, and we know how. No mystery involved. A post about the Great Wall of China was my personal introduction to the Tartarian Empire theory, so I feel like it's important I cover it. Tartarian theorists give the usual reasons as to why this is a Tartarian structure. We couldn't build it today, it was built using advanced technology, we found it, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. I'm sure you get the picture by now. But one other piece of evidence that gets thrown into the mix by theorists is the idea that the Great Wall is in fact facing the wrong way. Their proof for this is the fact there are battlements on the southern side of the wall and gates on the northern side. Now, if you've watched any of my YouTube Shorts videos, you will know that I've covered this quite extensively recently, but for the sake of today's long form video, I will go into a little more detail. Theorists say these southern battlements and northern gates are proof that the Great Wall was actually built by a northern power as defense against ancient China, not the other way around. However, as hard as this may be to believe, there is a far more logical explanation, and it doesn't involve airships or magnetic levitation devices. The Great Wall of China was not only built to defend against invading armies from the north, but it is also built to defend against armies that had already made it into China through other areas. This is because the Great Wall of China was built gradually in sections over the course of over 2,000 years, and initially it did not stretch the entire length of the dynasty's borders. Because of this, battlements had to be built on the inside. Otherwise, armies could cross into China in a different area, round the wall, and without the battlements they would have free rein to attack from the inside. The inward-facing defences were also built so they could be used against retreating armies as they tried to flee the area. People also claim that the defensive structures on the Great Wall of China that are built on the top of mountains would not be necessary, as armies would not attack from these places as they are very difficult to reach. This is in turn used as proof that the wall is in fact Tartarian and it was built using ancient advanced technology. However, there are two incredibly obvious reasons why you build defences on the top of mountains. The first one is mountains make really good vantage points. If you build something on the high ground, you can see the enemy coming and you have more chance to prepare for them. This is not a difficult thing to understand. Secondly, mountains and high terrain are difficult to cross, but they are not impossible to cross. Armies will instinctively attack the least defended part of a border. So if you leave a gap in a border around a mountain, the armies will go there, and not only have you given them free rein to enter your kingdom, but you've also given them the high ground. Good job. As for the gates on the northern side, there are two very obvious reasons why these exist. The first one is so the Chinese could send scouts into the northern territories, and the second is so they could send armies into the northern territories to intercept their enemies, much like what we saw Su Da do against the Mongols in 1372. This idea that gates on the north side prove that the wall was built by a northern power is absolutely ridiculous and very short-sighted and historically tone deaf as well. By the same logic, Hadrian's Wall in the UK must have been built by the Picts instead of the Romans, as that too had gates on the northern side. The Great Wall is absolutely colossal in size, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to discredit it or downplay it in any way. It has absolutely every right to be considered one of the wonders of the world. It is breathtaking. But this idea that we could not have constructed it, or our ancestors could not have constructed it, is absolutely ridiculous. If conventional history said that it took us 6 months to build the Great Wall of China, then yes, that would be insane. But it took 2,000 years to build the Great Wall of China. It's 13,000 miles long. That works out with 6.5 miles a year. That is very much doable. The Great Wall was built by several dynasties over several millennia, like I already mentioned, and it started as like bits of patchwork projects in the 7th century BC. It wasn't until the end of the Warring States period and the rise of the Qin dynasty that it became a uniform project. Other dynasties that followed afterwards rebuilt, modified, and extended the wall to their own liking until it was finally finished by the Ming dynasty in the 1600s. However, even to this day, there is no such thing as one singular Great Wall, as a lot of the sections of the wall built by different dynasties don't actually link together. All of these records and all of these timelines objectively prove without any doubt that the Great Wall of China was not built by the Tartarian Empire. Like I said with many other buildings earlier, such as St. Peter's Basilica, the immense timeline of these constructions proves they were not built with advanced technology, as if they had been built with advanced technology, they would have been finished much sooner, and the Great Wall of China would be a lot neater in its layout and uniformity. Unless, of course, you're going to start suggesting that these godly Tartarian architectural wizards were so far advanced that they couldn't link two walls together. So to conclude, the Great Wall of China was built by the Chinese. It does not face the wrong way, and it is not a Tartarian structure. Although the Great Wall of China and many other famous monuments throughout our history are wrongly credited to Tartaria, the era I want to focus on now is a lot more recent. The mid-19th century is usually used as the ballpark figure for when theorists say the Mudfloods and the Great Reset happened. This is because we started seeing drastic changes in our culture and our lives around this period. Lifestyles, foreign affairs, warfare and architecture all saw significant revolutions in this period, and theorists say this is evidence of a Great Reset. But this shift wasn't because of a Great Reset, it's because of a huge wave that swept across the entire world. I'm not talking about mudfloods, I'm talking about the Industrial Revolution. As we entered the second half of the 18th century, the world started to change drastically, and as a result, architecture had to change with it. The success of the Industrial Revolution spread across the entire world, but it was dependent on one thing: workers. More factories meant there were more jobs available, and people were drawn away from farm work to live in the city. But this was a problem because the workers were dependent on something too: food. So these farms that were already struggling to keep up with demand were now losing all of their workers to factories as well, which meant they were struggling to keep up with the nutritional demands needed for the growing population. But this problem was solved well in advance thanks to a man named Thomas Cook. Yes, I know it's spelled Coke, but apparently it's pronounced Cook. And his agricultural reformations in the United Kingdom in the 18th century completely changed the course of our history. British agriculture had hardly changed since the Norman conquest in 1066, but Cook's efforts to crossbreed grass to make livestock more productive, and also removing fallow fields from crop rotation and replacing them with hardy vegetables like turnips, drastically increased food production. More food meant more people could afford to raise children, which in turn led to even more people, which in turn led to more houses being needed. Not only that, bigger factories were needed to meet production demands, bigger train stations were needed to transport the goods, and bigger hospitals were needed to deal with the sick. The population was growing faster than it ever had before in human history, and the world simply needed to keep up. This meant that cities and urban planners couldn't afford to spend 20 years building limestone houses for everyone anymore, and the already limited space in cities meant that they couldn't build large structures like they used to, had to pack people into smaller areas, and the grand scale of old world architecture, in city centres at least, became the first casualty of this shift in architectural needs. Next to go was intricacy. Skilled craftsmen like masons and thatchers were pushed aside in favour of mass-produced building materials that were much cheaper and much quicker to produce. The soul of pre-industrial architecture started to fade into the black smoke of factories, and the world, sadly, never looked back. Industrialisation is also why a lot of cities with fantastic architecture from back in the day are now quite poor. Places in the UK such as Birmingham, Coventry and Huddersfield were hubs of the Industrial Revolution, but when production reinvented itself after the World Wars, these cities fell behind and never regained their former glory. So these magnificent buildings in poor areas aren't evidence of Tartaria, they're just very clear evidence that there's a big difference between getting rich and staying rich. At the end of the 19th century, architecture had to evolve again. Populations continued to grow and people were continuously drawn into urban areas, but the problem was these urban areas are running out of space. Across the pond in America, a new movement was taking shape thanks to architects such as Louis Sullivan. In the late 19th century, the United States was starting to have a real problem with finding space in rapidly developing urban areas. These cities were seeing a rate of development that was unlike anything the United States had ever seen before, and the architectural plans of old just could not keep up with the demand. Sullivan was one of the first people to notice that the old architectural styles with long construction times could not keep up with the demand, and big financial crises in 1873 and 1893 also put companies off splashing big piles of cash on really elaborate construction projects. So Sullivan devised a great plan to get around this. Instead of building out like people used to, he decided he was going to start building up. He rejected the Greek and Roman influences that guided so many of his peers and created what he called an American architectural style. He introduced new, cheaper types of building materials such as concrete and steel, which not only drastically decreased construction time, but also meant we could build structures that were much taller than ever before. This quicker, more space efficient and more cost efficient style of construction proved to be a huge success across the United States, and many of his buildings can still be seen across the country to this day. Sullivan also came up with the architectural philosophy of form ever follows function. Basically, this means that a shape of a building should be determined by its use rather than by its aesthetics. This is why ornate facades and domed roofs rarely appear in modern buildings now, because they do not support the function of the building. They are purely for an aesthetic purpose and they do nothing to actually help the building make money or fulfill its use, which is what a lot of modern architecture is unfortunately focused around. However, there are a few exceptions to Sullivan's work, such as the Sullivan Center in Chicago that he helped build in 1899. This building includes a fantastic ornate facade at the entrance, which shows that the aesthetic was still considered. However, the look of the building is quite obviously no longer as important as the building fulfilling its purpose in the most efficient way possible, which is a trademark and a blueprint of a lot of modern architecture. Urban planning and local politics also explain why such elaborate buildings are built in the middle of nowhere, especially in the United States. Buildings like the Illinois State Capitol building were built in a place of low population density, and theorists argue that according to the mainstream history narrative, we would have no reason to build such huge buildings for such a small population. But this argument suffers from several glaring oversights. First of all, states rarely built their capital buildings in fully developed cities, as they didn't want to concentrate all of the power into just one area. Putting all of the political power in one big city not only made it difficult to separate political and commercial interests, but it also made it look like the local government only cared about the residents in that one particular city, neglecting people in other towns and rural communities. Some capital buildings are also placed centrally within their state, regardless of how much or how little was nearby. These capital buildings were generally put in the centre of the state, so it allowed citizens to have access to it no matter where in the state they lived. An example of this is the Pennsylvania State Capitol, which is in the surprisingly small central city of Harrisburg, rather than the western Pittsburgh or eastern Philadelphia. A third reason is the historical context of these cities that a lot of theorists seem to ignore. Just because the places that host state capitol buildings are much smaller than their state counterparts now, it doesn't mean it has always been that way. For instance, the previously mentioned Illinois State Capitol building was built in Springfield instead of Chicago, as at the time both cities were around the same size. But in the years that followed the Capitol building's construction, Springfield started to stagnate and Chicago went on to become one of the biggest commercial hubs for all of 20th century America. A fourth reason is for strategic purposes, and a lot of capitals are placed in easy to defend places, especially in the early days of the United States. For example, the state capital for Michigan was moved to Lansing from Detroit in 1847, as Detroit was too close to the Canadian border, which is still under British control at the time. The final and arguably most crucial point is population foresight. You build infrastructure for the amount of people you are going to have, not the amount of people you currently have. If you keep building infrastructure for the amount of people you have at the time, you're always going to be playing catch up because the population keeps increasing and you won't have enough infrastructure to accommodate the population. The same rules apply to state capitol buildings in the United States. They weren't built to accommodate the 5,000 or 10,000 people that lived there at the time. They were built to accommodate the hundreds of thousands of people that were going to live there in decades and generations to come. Just because politicians and urban planners lack foresight now, it doesn't mean that's always been a problem. The reason I mention all of this is because architecture is a very complex and very interesting field, and I think a lot of people really take it for granted. Like, there is so much variety and diversity and history and culture to our architecture. To simply just dumb all of that down to the Tartarians did it is completely tone deaf to reality. Architecture follows culture, it follows the religion, it follows our needs, it follows our demands, and it follows patterns. It does not, in any capacity, follow the narrative of the Tartarian Empire. Alleged smoking gun proof of the Tartarian Empire are the World's Fairs that happened throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. For those of you who don't know, a World's Fair is like a convention of technological achievements from all over the world. Arguably the most famous one was the Great Exhibition in London of 1851. World Fairs can be split into three distinct eras: the industrialization era, the cultural exchange era, and the national branding era. But today we're going to focus on the industrialization era, as this is the time period that most Tartarian theorists refer to when they talk about the World's Fairs. Their argument is that these huge structures that were built especially for these events were either old Tartarian buildings that were destroyed after the event to hide their Tartarian roots, or they were new buildings that were built and destroyed using stolen Tartarian technology. They point to the huge scale and elaborate details of these structures to highlight their belief that our ancestors could not have built such amazing structures in the timelines that are offered by our records. But for such a huge cornerstone of the Tartarian conspiracy theory, the World Fairs are a surprisingly easy part of it to debunk. The main issue with referencing the World Fairs in this video is that Tartarians do take real life facts about the World Fairs and then they appropriate them or misrepresent them or miscontextualize them to suit their own narratives. For example, they will often reference the fact that a lot of these structures are built within 2 years, which shows that they were built with technology that is far beyond our understanding. But they generally fail to mention what these buildings are made out of. If these buildings are made out of limestone, marble, granite and other hard rocks, then yes, it would be incredibly difficult to make these in 2 years. But the reality is a lot of these were actually temporary structures that are made out of plasterboard and plywood. An easy way to disprove conventional history's claim that these were temporary structures would be to find a picture of these structures that predates their respective World Fair by a few years, but no one has ever managed to produce any of these photographs or records. I wonder why that is. Some of the structures that were built for World Fairs were actually permanent structures though, and these are the ones that are still here today. However, a lot of these permanent structures weren't actually finished in time for the World Fairs they were intended for. So the permanent structures are the ones that are still here, and the temporary ones aren't around anymore. Do you see how that works? Next, I want to look at a few World Fairs that Tartarian theorists talk about the most to show you that these places in fact do not have any Tartarian heritage. The first one I want to look at is the General Art and Industrial Exposition of Stockholm in 1897. Straight off the bat, this picture is a digitally restored photochrome capture. If the world elite really wanted to hide the heritage and roots of these places, why would they digitally restore pictures of them? Additionally, the main hall in this picture was in fact a temporary wooden structure and it took us 2 years to build it. We know this because it was designed by an architect named Ferdinand Boberg, who was also commissioned to design structures for the World Fairs in 1904 in Kansas and the 1914 Baltic Exhibition in Malmö. He is also responsible for a lot of the pre-war architecture that remains in Sweden today, such as the Rosenberg House, the Stockholm Central Post Office, Theo Gallery, the Malmö Central Post Office and Björtorp Slot. So we know who built it, why they built it and when they built it, all of which disproves the idea that this was a permanent old world structure that was destroyed by the world elite to hide its Tartarian roots. And if we're going to go with the argument that they are in fact new buildings that were constructed using stolen Tartarian technology, then we can debunk that idea as well. The Nordic Museum is one of the permanent structures that was built for the 1897 exhibition. However, it was not finished in time and it wasn't actually fully completed until as late as 1907. So if it was being built with hyper-advanced stolen Tartarian technology, then how on earth did they not manage to finish it in time? Finally, absolutely none of this takes into account the hundreds of old buildings that are still intact all over Stockholm and the rest of Sweden. So if the world elite did want to erase all traces of the old world, they've clearly not done a very good job of it. My second and most notable example is from the 1901 World's Fair in Buffalo, New York. Facebook page and leading Tartarian conspirator Question Everything seems to post about this a lot. So let's see what he has to say about it. In this video, he questions the lighting and asks where the electricity came from. His argument is that electricity was still pretty rare in these days, so there's no way they could have had the capability to power such an elaborate event. But the whole point of a World's Fair was that it was a convention for groundbreaking innovations, and one of the groundbreaking innovations for the 1901 World's Fair was hydroelectric power. For this particular World's Fair, the current of Niagara Falls was used to generate hydroelectric power using the AC electric system. This system was developed by two men. One was George Westinghouse and the other one was a man I'm sure we're all familiar with, Nikola Tesla. There are several documents available online that confirm the use of hydroelectric power at both the 1893 and the 1901 World's Fairs, with Nikola Tesla personally attending the former of those two events. So unless theorists are suddenly going to turn around and call Nikola Tesla a liar, this explanation clearly shows us how they managed to power the 1901 World's Fair using hydroelectric power. It's also absolutely ridiculous to me that Question Everything says we cannot illuminate buildings like this today, when Blackpool in England, which is a significantly poorer area than Buffalo in the early 20th century, manages to do it every single year for the Blackpool illuminations. Let's also not forget the incredible nighttime shows that you can see in cities like Shenzhen. So you're really going to look at places like this and tell me the same people couldn't have managed to do this. And the cherry on top is, much like the 1897 Stockholm exhibition, most of these structures were in fact temporary. I even managed to find the original design blueprints for the main hall that clearly show it was constructed out of wood, and it is annotated in several places to confirm this. Other buildings that were constructed for the event were also temporary, and I can prove this beyond any doubt. I did some digging and I managed to find some meeting minutes from the Board of Women Managers of the Pan American Exposition. Let's see what they said. The minutes for a meeting that took place in December 1900 clearly detail a discussion about an art gallery being built for the event. Built being the key word in that sentence. On page 53 of this document, it states, "A fireproof building for use as an art gallery is to be erected in the park and will be occupied in place of the Albright Art Gallery, which cannot be completed in time for the opening of the exposition." So if the art gallery was a permanent old world structure that was built by the Tartarians, why are they talking about building it less than 6 months before the event began? The Albright Art Gallery was in fact not completed in time for the World's Fair. It was eventually completed in 1905 and it is now known as the Buffalo Art Museum. It's strange how, according to theorists, we are allegedly unable to replicate Tartarian architecture, yet we managed to build this at least 40 years after the Tartarian Empire supposedly fell. So much like everything else in this theory, the timeline just doesn't add up. On a side note though, if you want to know more about the 1901 World's Fairs, then I really recommend you check out the Pan American collection that is on the Buffalo University website. There are literally hundreds of contemporary sources from the 1901 World's Fair available completely for free online. I'm talking about building blueprints, I'm talking about meeting minutes, business ledgers, even adverts from local hotels are all available here. I really recommend you check it out. It's an absolute goldmine for contemporary information. But speaking of World Fairs, I want to take a quick moment to call out our good friend James W. Lee. Now, for those of you who don't know, James W. Lee is a leading Tartarian theorist thanks to his book, The One World Tartarians, which was published in 2020. In this book, he claims that the World's Fairs are evidence of the Tartarian Empire, and he spends 13 pages listing every single World's Fair that happened from 1790 to 1930. But James, we need to have a word about this. This is the first page of Appendix 2 in the One World Tartarians. If you look closely, you'll see these numbers in brackets at the end of each entry. What do they represent, I hear you ask? Well, interestingly, these numbers have the exact same formatting as the citation references on Wikipedia. But that's just a massive coincidence, right? Wrong. It turns out these numbers correlate exactly with the citations on a Wikipedia article titled List of World's Fairs. Just to clarify, leading Tartarian theorist James W. Lee copy and pasted Wikipedia directly into his book while claiming other people are intentionally misleading you. This alone makes me question any legitimacy anyone gives this book. Like Wikipedia, James, come on. Finally, I mentioned this in my last video, but I want to bring it up again. World Fairs still happen. They're not this long lost, forgotten, ancient, erased from history event that the world elite don't want you to know about, the last World Fairs finished on the 13th of October 2025. This World's Fair took place in Japan, and unsurprisingly it was hosted in a temporary wooden structure that was built specifically for the event. Who could have guessed? The important thing I want to address at this stage is the idea that we cannot replicate old world wonders in the modern day. If you ever see a Tartarian post on social media, it'll probably be a picture or a video of an old building with one of three captions. But like every other Tartarian argument we've covered today, it falls apart under a little bit of scrutiny. The idea that we do not and cannot build wonders anymore is a blatant lie. Just because our architectural preferences have changed, it does not mean we are incapable of building wonders, and our crowning achievements of architecture are no less wondrous because of it. Buildings we have today like the Burj Khalifa, Taipei 101, the Sydney Opera House, Hotel Lisboa and Marina Bay Sands all prove that we can and still create wonders to this day. I can see the response in the comments now. Yeah, we can build those wonders now, but we can't build old wonders anymore. Again, that's a blatant lie. An example of an old wonder that we can reconstruct is Notre Dame, and we proved this when much of it needed to be rebuilt after the fire in 2019. That renovation work only took our modern construction workers 5 years to complete compared to the original 200 years for the construction time, by the way. So how does that fit into the superior Tartarian technology narrative? Also, we still have plenty of skilled stonemasons in the modern day. If we didn't, how do you think we would renovate and restore these old buildings? And this tradition of building old world style structures does in fact continue to this very day. This is proven by the Cathedral of the Resurrection of Christ in Moscow, which was completed in 2020. We should also mention the People's Salvation Cathedral in Romania, which began construction in 2010 and is the tallest Orthodox church in the world at 126 meters tall. Also, the Palace of the Nation in Tajikistan was built in 2008, the Rukyat Palace in Turkmenistan was built in 1999, and the Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque in Oman was built in 2001. So we can quite clearly build old world style monuments in the modern day as we continue to do so. I actually think it's a bit disrespectful to modern architects and modern construction workers to suggest that we are unable to replicate these buildings in the modern day. Just because some of the West has lost its spark, it doesn't mean the rest of the world is falling in line behind them. And like I touched on earlier, the West focusing on function over aesthetics isn't necessarily a sign of regression. It's just a sign of shifting priorities. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I don't like a lot of modern Western architecture. But here's the catch. The governments and the companies that are funding these builds want to make as much money as possible in the most time and cost-effective way possible. Why would they spend significantly more money on more expensive, difficult to source and difficult to transport materials that will require more expensive specialist workers when they could just hire someone locally to build it much quicker with easily sourced materials and labour? Is it soulless? Yes. Do I like it? No. Do these companies and governments care? Also no. Tartarian theorists believe it would have been impossible for our ancestors in the 19th century to build these amazing feats of architecture, in spite of all the evidence that proves the exact opposite. But again, I can already see all the comments from here. Why didn't you mention this building? Why didn't you mention that building? Why did you mention this place and not that one? Blah blah blah, so on and so forth. Do you realise how many buildings are allegedly Tartarian according to Tartarian theorists? To give you a quick idea, here's a quick list of every building, landmark and monument that Question Everything tried to link to Tartaria between June and August 2025. All of that and this random grain mill in Richmond, Indiana. Yes, of course, our ancestors couldn't possibly have built this simple square-based brick structure just a few decades before World War I. It's quite obviously the work of an ancient advanced global civilization that had healing bells and airships but lost out to some mud. That makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? So why have I not mentioned every allegedly Tartarian building? It's simple. It's because it's very, very difficult for me to debunk every single Tartarian architectural claim when theorists seem to believe that every single pile of bricks on the face of the planet that predates World War I is evidence of Tartaria. Like, come on, how is this evidence of an ancient advanced civilization? If you are watching this video as a builder and you think you could not recreate this in modern technology, then you should not be a builder. None of the places in the list you just saw and none of the places I mentioned in this video show any evidence whatsoever to support the existence of Tartaria, and that is a definitive, objective conclusion. But sorry, I'm getting distracted. The fact of the matter is, all proof of Tartaria completely vanishes when you remove the miscontextualizations, when you remove the misrepresentations, when you remove the appropriation of facts that theorists seem to cling to, and you replace it with actual contextual history that beyond any shadow of a doubt proves that the Tartarian Empire never existed. That is the MO of these Tartarian pages though. They throw baseless accusations and they try to slap a Tartaria label on anything they can in the hope that something sticks and gets them clicks. Because at the end of the day, monetization is the only thing any of these pages actually care about. Their goal is to saturate social media platforms with this evidence and miscontextualize it so casual viewers feel like they have no choice but to believe in Tartaria. But if you scratch under the surface and research the background of literally any Tartarian building, or any general Tartarian post for that matter, then the complete illusion and narrative that these people are trying to spin to you completely falls flat on its face. Sorry, I got a little carried away at the end there. But thank you very much for watching. If you're still watching at this point, then I feel like I've more than earned a like and a subscribe. This is a very long episode. It's probably going to be the longest one of the entire series. So again, I really appreciate that you stuck around this long. I will be carrying on with the Tartarian videos in the near future, but the next long form video I upload probably won't be about debunking Tartaria. I've noticed that a lot of the long form videos I've been uploading recently are all about the same sort of thing. I don't want to become one of those content creators that's a bit of a one-trick pony. Like, if you watch my shorts videos, you'll see that I cover quite a diverse range of topics, and I want to bring that idea into my long form content as well. So although the next video probably won't be about Tartaria, the one after that will be, and I will be continuing and finishing this Tartarian series. But for the time being, like I said, thanks for watching, stay safe, and I hope I will see you for the next video.